It's pretty common knowledge by now to say that Assassin's Creed Unity did not do well for the public. It was besieged with a shit ton of bugs, frame rate problems and some pretty amusing looking glitches. This meant that Ubisoft was on damage control, something that a lot of people still to this day would say they're still deep in the midst of. But hey, Assassin's Creed Unity is a distant memory now. Fast forward 1 year later in 2015, a new Assassin's Creed title was born, and that was Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Now, I'll be completely honest, I was pretty skeptical about this game when it was first released. I was one of the people that was left uncertain if Ubisoft would manage to f up yet another Assassin's Creed launch, but thankfully this was not the case. Syndicate did not have a bad reputation at launch. Sadly, sale numbers did not reflect that. The mess that was left behind from Unity's buggy launch heavily affected the number of sales Assassin's Creed Syndicate did. But let's just take the sales and the launch stuff aside. How is Assassin's Creed Syndicate as an actual game? Well, let's be honest. It's pretty hard to pretend that the Assassin's Creed franchise is not feeling a bit tiresome at this point. You see, while the change in setting and time periods is something that personally I'd never get sick of, it's just the fatigue of the same mission and structure that felt like it was beginning to weigh on the series due to the annual release of each game. This was my one and only concern coming into Syndicate. Did it address the fatigue that the franchise was experiencing? Well, after playing the game from start to finish at launch and then once again recently, I have the answer. And that answer is pretty complicated, but that's what I want to go over in this video. This is Assassin's Creed Syndicate 8 years later. But before I get into it, if you do enjoy this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button as it will help me out quite a lot. And with all of that said, let's just get right into the video. When talking about an Assassin's Creed game, the topic of the time period and setting the game takes place in is one that must be talked about, and Assassin's Creed Syndicate is no exception. Set in Victorian era London, Syndicate setting is actually the very first setting out of the 13 mainland games that takes place in an era where photographic evidence is actually obtainable. Ubisoft Quebec, who were the Ubisoft team that worked on Syndicate, had quite a great deal of inspiration for the game. And because Assassin's Creed Syndicate is set the closest to the present day, there's plenty of reference material to look through. That's why throughout the world of Syndicate, the attention to detail with each historical landmark is pretty spot on. Take Big Ben for example. I remember the moment the whole map of London was accessible. The first thing I did was scale the Big Ben, and it did not disappoint. The Ubisoft Quebec team even went to London in real life to discover the actual names of pubs just from that era just to include in the game. The amount of effort invested in researching the environment is pretty commendable, and I will give Ubisoft their credit for creating a truly authentic depiction of London. I even appreciate how the game fully embraces its historical setting, capturing the essence of a time on the brink of a technological revolution. You see, implementing that aspect into Syndicate's narrative was something that truly excited me. I'm a big history fan, and I remember learning about Victorian London in school and the whole Industrial Revolution side of it. Syndicate's Victorian London is more near the ending of the Industrial Revolution, which, if you don't know what that is, just imagine you're a person living in Victorian London around the 18th or 19th century. Something massive is coming, and that is the Industrial Revolution, a game changer for society. You see, before this, things were pretty manual and traditional. People had to make things by hand. Agriculture was a massive deal, and life was mostly centered around small communities. Now here comes the Industrial Revolution, shaking things up. It's a wave of technological advancements and changes in how things are made. Suddenly there are these machines powered by steam engines doing jobs that used to take a shit ton of people. Factories started to spring up, and instead of making, let's say, a few dozen shoes a day, they're churning out hundreds. That's what the Industrial Revolution is. Throughout the world of Assassin's Creed Syndicate, you'll explore 7 main parts of London: the main city, the River Thames, Whitechapel, the Strand, Westminster, Lambeth and even Southwark. And throughout each of these areas in London, you're able to witness landmarks such as Westminster Abbey, Buckingham Palace, St Paul's Cathedral, Trafalgar Square and even the Tower of London, and that's just naming a few. Every single detail in this Victorian London setting, whether it's big or small, seamlessly merges into one of the most realistic settings in the series' history. Glass tainted by soot carries imperfections, which tells the story of the new technology that mass-produced it. You can see walls that are just completely decorated with advertisements, and the Thames flows as a dynamic moving life force, filled with boats and debris alike. Parkouring from boat to boat on the Thames River was kind of like a reverse version of that classic game called Frogger. One thing I really admire is how Assassin's Creed Syndicate introduces actual historical figures and events into its fictional narrative. Throughout the game, you'll engage with characters like Charles Darwin and Queen Victoria, and witness events such as the construction of the Thames Tunnel. This to me makes the game feel more immersive, and I've mentioned in many times in previous videos that immersion is something that's very high up on my list in terms of what makes an open world game good. It also showcases the developers' commitment to accuracy and authenticity, which is something I'll always respect Ubisoft for. Well, in the older games that is. I couldn't explain to you what is going on with the more recent games. Of course, not everything about Victorian London in Syndicate is a positive. You see, while I love how immersive and detailed a lot of the things are in the game, there's one aspect that left me quite disappointed, and that was the very wide streets. Now, before anyone comments it, yes, I know that is how Victorian London was portrayed back then, but in contrast to the narrow alleys and rooftop paths of previous Assassin's Creed games, Syndicate's wide street can sometimes feel empty and lacking in opportunities for parkour, making free roaming seem pretty pointless. Do you ever browse the YouTube homepage and you see one of those parkour montages or videos on Assassin's Creed? What's the game that's always being shown? It's Assassin's Creed Unity, right? Well, why is that? That's because the city in Assassin's Creed Unity is very narrow and perfect for parkour, whereas Victorian London is the complete opposite. Although the game's new grappling hook feature aids in traversal, it does not entirely compensate for the limited environmental variety in certain areas. However, its drawback lies in the inability to aim it freely, as it only attaches to preset points on a structure. It's similar to Batman's line launcher. This tool can connect buildings, creating a zipline for both fry twins to swiftly traverse. There's also the inclusion of hijackable horse-drawn carriages, which is a great addition to the game's world, providing a faster means to reach missions, execute speedy getaways, or even transport kidnapped blighters. It's a bit odd to earn XP for causing unprovoked destruction by mowing down street lampposts with a horse, but hey, I'll gladly accept it. Given London's massive size, the inclusion of carriages and trains for faster and stylish travel is pretty appreciated. Horse-drawn carriages serve not only as transportation, but also as a slow-moving platform to engage in for combat. Hopping on top, I could fight enemies or perhaps leap onto rival carriages for a takedown, and if there was not enough carriages on the streets, a bit of Grand Theft Carriage allowed me to quickly carriage jack one. To be fair, the very wide streets do have some advantages. They facilitate more realistic carriage chases and provide a sense of scale for the game's historical landmarks like Buckingham Palace and St. Paul's Cathedral. One thing to note about Victorian London in Syndicate is that this particular time period was incredibly dark and grim. There was a lot of rampant crime, murders, and even the haunting presence of supernatural figures. Child labour was widespread, and the entire city lived in fear. In Syndicate's early development stages, when it was known as Codename Victory, the game was supposed to embrace a more dark and gritty tone, featuring a protagonist named Samuel Fay. However, somewhere along the line things changed. The reasons for this significant shift in tone during development are not entirely clear, but it's pretty evident that fan outrage played a role in this, which led to the abandonment of Samuel Fay as the game's sole protagonist. Anyway, to sum up Victorian London, it's undeniably stunning. The game kicks off with the introduction of its industrial smog-filled London, and nobody can deny that it's not pretty breathtaking. Despite any legendary and occasionally exaggerated flaws of the Anvil Next engine, it does definitely deliver a visually impressive and relatively vibrant portrayal of Victorian London. Now let's talk about the story of Assassin's Creed Syndicate. This to me is the weakest part of this game. I was not really a fan of the whole narrative of Syndicate, from its plot to the main villain to just how the Fry twins constantly clashed. It did not really feel like an Assassin's Creed story to me, more like an attempt at a British humour movie. The story of Syndicate revolves around the twin siblings Evie and Jacob Fry, both assassins on a mission to free London from the corrupt influence of the Templars. While it's not necessary to have played previous Assassin's Creed games to grasp Syndicate's story, having that background information does kind of improve the experience. For example, there's that one sequence where you explore the mansion of Edward Kenway. However, Syndicate shares a relatively underwhelming downside, where there's a struggle to prioritize between the present day and historical storylines. This indecision kind of frustrated me a bit. I'll talk more about the modern day storyline later in this video, but for now let's just focus on the assassin's story. The game starts outside of London, where we pretty much do a quote-unquote tutorial during which both Jacob and Evie target different individuals for assassination. We then travel to London, where the Fry twins are tasked with locating the Piece of Eden. We also meet Henry Green, an old friend of the Fry twins' father, where he awaits with a distress call. London is in the grip of the Templar Grandmaster Crawford Starrick, which prompted the Assassin Brotherhood's intervention. Throughout the entire story of Assassin's Creed Syndicate, there's a lot of historical figures like Charles Darwin, Charles Dickens, Karl Marx and so on. I'll go a lot more in depth on these historical figures later in this video. Compared to some of the weaker entries in the series, Syndicate's overall story is surprisingly interesting, although it still carries some of the reoccurring issues found in the overall story arc. While the Take Back London theme is quite entertaining, the callback of Templars, Pieces of Eden, and even the modern day storyline seems like the Achilles heel of Syndicate. It's not that their inclusion is out of place, but rather it seems like the writers are improvising on the spot, making these sci-fi elements seem somewhat contrived and at times unnecessary. This is pretty unfortunate, given that the 19th century struggle for control over London could stand strong enough to warrant its own game, raising the question of whether Syndicate's own story is hindering its potential for a more entertaining experience. For most of the story, it just feels rushed. We don't really learn much about the siblings and their background. Sure, there are some big information dumps in the Assassin's Creed wiki and stuff, but it would have been a lot better if the game itself could incorporate these details into storytelling. Like for example, the siblings have this thing where they take a bit of the victim's blood, but the game never bothers to explain why. Their father is talked about a lot during the game, but we don't even find out his name until a very boring mission later in the game. The two main characters, Evie and Jacob, have very different personalities and also very different ways of doing things. Evie is more calm and composed, drawn to the Pieces of Eden, and then on the other hand, Jacob is more brash and cocky, aiming to free London's streets from the Templar control to gang warfare. Evie is more on the stealthier side, whereas Jacob is more of a brawler and relies on his fist rather than sneaking around. Beyond the gameplay, there's a shit ton of sibling banter, and their believable chemistry is a credit to the voice actors. However, I did find it to be rather fast paced, which at times seems pointless and not fleshed out. The writing is somewhat at fault here. While there are some genuinely funny lines, most of the dialogue is pretty flat and predictable. Now for me, personally, I favour Evie over Jacob, and unlike her brother, she does not constantly spout out cool sounding but nonsensical one-liners. Both characters are playable at any time, except during a mission. You see, when you watch the cinematic trailers, it heavily featured Jacob, suggesting that he was the only playable character. However, without conducting a detailed count of missions, it's safe to say that Evie receives a fair share of game time. In fact, I often found her presence for stealth over combat to align better with my playstyle. Nevertheless, this does not discount her ability to hold her own in fights. Thanks to the incredibly easy combat mechanics, Evie can effortlessly handle groups of enemies without any issues. The only downside to their personal story arc is that it feels like an important chunk of it occurred off screen, which makes it seem like a lot of aspects of their story just are missing, making their character development feel abrupt. The story also struggles with other characters. There's only a few big characters and they pop in and out so quickly, switching sides so often, that the betrayals and twists do not really hit that hard. Take Pearl Atway for example. When we first meet her, she forms an alliance with Jacob Fry, but then, what a surprise, she's got a Templar affiliation, so we end up killing her. Her betrayal to me was so underwhelming that I could not care less if she was on our side or not. She didn't really impact me enough to form any sort of emotion towards her. Even the main villain, Crawford Starrick, he's your typical bad guy who controls everything. Factories, transportations, banks, governments, but we never actually see him do anything bad. It's just because he's a Templar and sometimes shoots his servants that we're supposed to think he's this big scary guy. He's the definition of all bark, no bite. Just a few unusual cutscenes of him either drinking tea or playing the piano, and we're supposed to feel some sort of shiver down our spine. He even has the classic villain mustache, and if that was not a clear enough sign of his evil nature, he also has no interaction with the protagonist until the very last sequence. The main villain of a video game should not be meeting the main characters for the first time in the last few minutes of the game, but Starrick is too busy hiding in his office like a little bitch. Jacob's main goal is to take him down, and since Crawford is after the Piece of Eden, Evie also has a goal. You see, when it comes to the ending of the story, I gotta say it was very underwhelming. As you know, Ubisoft tried to make Crawford Starrick stand out as this evil mastermind who left his mark on London. However, his ending story was sorely underdeveloped. It frustrated me because the moment that Evie and Jacob arrived in London at the very beginning of the game, Starrick was magically aware of them. He even had numerous opportunities to eliminate them, but instead of taking action, he decided to just sit in his office, play the piano, sing songs, and merely throw a tantrum when he learned that Evie and Jacob disrupted his operations. And then there's his boss fight. Oh man, it was one of the worst I've ever played. It essentially involved a repetitive cycle of stab, stab, block, block, stab, getting thrown across the room by Starrick, and then repeat. There's even moments where Starrick would throw one of the Fry twins about 2 meters away, and then all of a sudden they just teleport to the back of the room. Like, what? Is that Shroud of Eden on his neck capable of teleporting the Fry twins or something? It just did not make any sense. Eventually, after the 6,428th punch, we finally take him down, and that's quite literally it. we get knighted for our supposed good deeds by the Queen. Oh, and there was the whole Evie and Henry love story that remained in the background, subtly portrayed, while the emphasis was more focused on the family bond, which attempted to establish a more profound connection between the characters and, well, me, the player. Although the ending was not overly sentimental, it felt like a well-earned positive story, but it's very formulaic and it lacks a strong beginning or a satisfying end, with lots of targets that don't really add to the whole Templars evil plot. Plus, we can kill innocent policemen and royal guards without any consequences, so who is the real villain here? Assassin's Creed Syndicate is of course a game with a lot of historical landmarks. In fact, I mentioned this earlier in the video. But one aspect of Assassin's Creed Syndicate that I will say does an outstanding job is in its portrayal of historical figures. There's quite a lot of them in this game, and they are not just there for display, but rather they provide you with a great side story to them. For example, there's Charles Dickens, Charles Darwin, a young Arthur Conan Doyle, Karl Marx, Queen Victoria, and even Alexander Graham Bell, who's kind of like the Industrial Revolution version of Leonardo da Vinci from Assassin's Creed 2. These figures all give you missions and each one is unique. These types of missions would pretty much help you increase your reputation with them, and leveling up your reputation serves as a fantastic means to unlock new equipment, although the charm of just interacting with these famous figures alone was just enough for me. Alexander Graham Bell crafts new gadgets and weapons, and Florence Nightingale aids in saving the sick and poor. You'll join Charles Dickens in ghost hunting and rescue Karl Marx from potential killers. There's even a moment where Charles Darwin assists you in blowing up a drug lab. It's absurd yet enjoyable, which is a refreshing departure for a franchise that often leans towards excessive seriousness. Now, just quickly focusing on Charles Dickens for example, I like how his questline involves a profound interest in the supernatural, which is actually a historically accurate trait. His mission is pretty much you delving into the Victorian legends like the notorious Spring Heel Jack or the haunted 50 Berkeley Square, and frequently the historical references are pretty multifaceted, even within seemingly unimportant side missions. One of my favourite features in Assassin's Creed Syndicate is the impeccable design of the assassination missions, which continues the black box setup that was introduced in Unity and thankfully expanded upon. In each mission, you're pretty much presented with 3 opportunities which offer flexibility in how you want to execute your target. When compared to Assassin's Creed Unity's black box missions, I did notice that these moments of opportunities in their design have more influence, and I like to think provide a heightened level of impact, forcing you to strategize more instead of going all out. Take for instance the scenario of infiltrating the Tower of London with Evie to confront Lucy Thorne. We can either go with the option to enlist the assistance of a Royal Guard member by orchestrating a pretend kidnapping, or you could just take on the black box mission in a more stealthy approach, which involves stealing a key for a sneaky entry. Of course, this doesn't mean you can't just barge open the door and take on a more frontal approach. That option definitely remains on the table. What I love about the black box missions is that there's a focus on choice, and it's entirely up to you on how you want to take each approach to the mission. Each black box assassination gives you a unique kill opportunity, which is definitely an improvement from Unity, where only a limited number of targets feature distinctive kill scenarios. In Assassin's Creed Syndicate, they've added something called secret opportunities, which is a massive change because the game intentionally avoids giving any clues. There's no arrows, no special vision cues, simply just a small notice hinting at hidden paths. Now, I love this because it actually encourages you to find all of the secret routes on your own, which makes exploring and strategizing during black box missions a lot more exciting and satisfying, especially once you manage to actually take out your target in the intended way. I'm somebody that if I mess up once, I cannot be bothered to restart the entire black box mission. Instead, I'll just slaughter everyone in my path until I reach my target. Okay, now I want to focus on a fundamental aspect of what makes Assassin's Creed, well, Assassin's Creed, and that is combat. In the realm of all-out combat, Jacob and Evie each have distinct fighting styles, both characterized by their brutality. However, Jacob's approach leans a bit more towards the bone-crushing intensity, reflecting the concealed weaponry which was pretty prevalent in the Victorian era. Knuckle dusters and some deadly blades like the kukri are stylishly incorporated into the combat repertoire, even in unarmed situations. Jacob exhibits a penchant for twisting arms and sending teeth. Despite the improved fluidity compared to the past AC games, there is still a noticeable fuzziness to the combat mechanics. Unlike the smooth combat experience of, let's say, Batman Arkham Knight, it aligns more with the rugged feel of Mad Max. The enemy AI lacks intelligence, often forming circles around you and attacking individually. It's like they have amnesia or something. Oh look, our friend is getting beaten up, let's just stand here and wait our turn. Ubisoft Quebec pretty much introduced new changes that encourage a more offensive playstyle. Dodging is replaced, and you must now time your button presses to evade incoming attacks. You see, while the idea of promoting aggression and reducing reliance on counter-based combat seems great on paper, the execution simply just falls short. Enemies are literal damage sponges and take way too many hits, especially early in the game. Combat becomes somewhat faster with weapon unlocks and upgrades, but one-on-one fights become so incredibly dull and repetitive. The lack of rewards or even training for mastering the combo system adds to the frustration. And speaking of the combo system, its execution is very inconsistent and will often confuse me when I'm pressing the same buttons over and over. Other games like I mentioned, such as Arkham Knight, have handled third-person melee combat more effectively. There's also the districts that have high level ratings. While you have the freedom to pretty much travel the map at will, it's important to consider that enemies in, let's say, Westminster pose a more difficult challenge than those in Whitechapel. The map clearly displays recommended levels for each district, introducing a new and enjoyable type of challenge previously unseen in the series at that point. Syndicate also lets you have the option to either buy or craft new equipment, upgrade pouches, and even upgrade weapons, among other choices. The game features a skill tree, with the exception of the final few skills which are unique to each character. Both Jacob and Evie share the majority of upgradable skills, covering a spectrum from standard health boosts to enhanced stealth and additional combat capabilities. However, the exclusive late game skills are tailored to the individual strengths of each character. Jacob, who emphasizes raw combat, gains survival and combat skills, whereas Evie, with her focus on stealth, acquires superior stealth abilities and the ability to become invisible when not moving. Sure, it's cool that she turns invisible, but that is so unrealistic and immersion breaking. I'm sure they could have figured out another way to implement a more stealth focused ability, rather than quite literally turning into John Cena. And speaking of John Cena, let's talk about stealth. I don't even think that made sense. Anyway, Assassin's Creed Syndicate excels in its stealth mechanics, with a lot of missions designed to heavily emphasize stealth. While the stealth in Syndicate is comparable to Unity, you may argue that Syndicate perfected it to a greater extent. Automatically being behind a wall occurs when in close proximity, and while the system may be basic, it does effectively fulfill its purpose. The game implements strict level checks for characters such as Evie or Jacob Fry, presenting tools and weapons with their own level systems. For instance, a low level pistol may not take out an enemy with a headshot due to its insufficient damage output, and this lack of effectiveness can compromise the intended stealth approach. Stealth has also undergone subtle adjustments in Syndicate. Crouching is back, which is now linked to a hood toggle, restricting the stealth to crouch mode. Unlike previous Assassin's Creed games, there's no snap cover, it's all contextual, which is kind of reminiscent of Assassin's Creed 3 and Black Flag, creating a more refined and focused experience. Whistling returns, and throwing knives can be used strategically to distract or lure guards. The ability to hide bodies is reinstated for a cleaner approach. However, the running assassinations, which are introduced for quick maneuvers since Assassin's Creed 3, have taken a questionable turn since Unity. What used to be quick purposeful animations have evolved into unnecessary sequences of maneuvers. The efficiency of the original animations like air assassinations with a single jump and stab have been changed quite a lot. Now these actions are quite disjointed, with the assassin first pouncing and then stabbing, creating a more jarring and time-consuming process. The game pretty much equips you with various tools for stealth, including throwing knives, smoke bombs, stun bombs, voltaic bombs that unleash bolts of electricity, and berserk darts for strategic enemy incapacitation. Additionally, the introduction of kidnapping also adds a very unique approach to stealth, allowing access to restricted areas and even increasing the overall enjoyment of social stealth. Despite some pretty odd features such as Evie's invisibility, Syndicate's stealth mechanics are generally considered pretty good, resembling Unity's while introducing elements that are much unique to Syndicate alone. There is also the introduction of a new indicator around the character during stealth, providing a clear indication of enemies nearby. In contrast to Unity, enemies can actually once again access rooftops, so you won't just be safe chilling on the rooftop. Environmental kills such as utilizing hanging barrels, and even the return of features like carrying bodies and whistling all contribute to Syndicate's stealth options. However, one thing I did not like, and I'd consider a downgrade, is the removal of being able to equip a weapon and also a tool at the same time, which was something that we've seen in Unity. I don't know why Ubisoft decided to remove that feature, but it's little things like that which can truly make opinions of a game be impactful. Certain missions in Syndicate are more tailored to Evie, offering a more stealth-oriented experience, and even often requiring her to clean up the mess that was created by Jacob. These missions showcase Evie's stealthier and more efficient approach at solving puzzles, which is quite evident in locations like the Kenway Mansion and also St. Paul's Cathedral. So yeah, stealth is something in Assassin's Creed Syndicate that I would consider a massive positive. In fact, in my ranking the stealth of each Assassin's Creed video, I placed Syndicate quite high up in terms of stealth because it was pretty impressive. In Assassin's Creed Syndicate, your central hub shifts from a cafe or a pub to an authentic steam train named Bertha. Yes, you quite literally have your very own Thomas the Tank Engine hurtling around Victorian London, and it is pretty enjoyable, I'm not gonna lie. Unlike static bases, the train is constantly on the move throughout the city, providing a dynamic element to your encounters with it. From the train hideout, you can craft weapons, organize your gang, catch up with your other twin, and even do side missions for the various people on board. Oh, and while you can stumble upon the train by simply exploring, the convenience of fast travel allows you to return whenever you need to. It kind of makes me feel old, knowing that Monteriggioni seems like quite a hell of a long time ago. However, the train's appeal is somewhat diminished, as most of the activities that can be performed on the train, such as upgrading your gang and gear, are already accessible to the pause menu. Other than the starting point of side missions, it offers limited engagement beyond its role as a hideout. But forget all the functionality side of it, I want to talk about how goddamn detailed and impressive it looks. It takes the concept of hiding in plain sight quite literally. Despite its cramped space, the hideout is very intricately detailed, featuring fireplaces, private studies, bedrooms, and a lot more, all compacted on this very small train. Depending on which Fright Twin you're playing as, you can actually have some very brief conversations with the other one. The train's close quarters makes it very easy to navigate, ensuring that you won't get lost while exploring. I mean, it is pretty hard to not get lost because it's a literal straight line, and because Assassin's Creed Syndicate is on a newer engine compared to a game like Assassin's Creed 2 and 3, the very intricate detail shines through in each of the textures. I do like that you can climb on top of the moving train and jump off whenever you're done with the hideout. Ubisoft's open world games, including Assassin's Creed, have one notable issue, and that is that they feel very formulaic and mass produced. This trend extends to titles like Watch Dogs, Far Cry, and The Crew. In Assassin's Creed Syndicate, everything falls into sets, collectible chests, beers, flower notes, music boxes, Templar hunts, gang strongholds, and so on. It's not the existence of these things, but how they're presented that's problematic. Imagine in a game like The Witcher 3 if every single chest was a collectible set, or if every Witcher contract was automatically highlighted on the map without notice boards. Syndicate mirrors this trend, as has Assassin's Creed since Assassin's Creed 2. The beers, royal correspondences, and illustrations do provide information, but simply just feel like fodder. Something like the war letters from Assassin's Creed Rogue would be more impactful. This connects to the issue of scattering chests across the map. Why not integrate them into quests like train robberies or boat raids? Important collectible from yellow chests could be side objectives in these missions, adding context to the otherwise pointless collections. In Assassin's Creed Syndicate, acquiring all flower notes triggers a cutscene where Henry proposes to Evie, even as early as sequence 4 when the relationship has not developed at all. This just shows Ubisoft did not exactly think ahead in that regard. To improve the structure of side missions and collectibles, it would be beneficial to ground them organically in the world, as perfected in games like The Witcher 3 and Red Dead Redemption 2. This isn't to say the side quests lack excitement or design. In fact, it's on the contrary, they're well crafted and enjoyable. However, the formulaic presentation hampers the fun and design. Spread across the map with no distinct scenarios, each mission just feels like an unnecessary grind, which should not be the case. The modern day elements of the series make a return, yet it's evident that Ubisoft is keen on minimizing it in Assassin's Creed Syndicate. This could be due to past criticisms from the fans of the series, or perhaps Ubisoft are just unsure about the direction to take with the modern day. I have conflicting feelings about this, as I find the modern day aspects very enjoyable, especially in games like Assassin's Creed Brotherhood and Assassin's Creed 3. However, Ubisoft has consistently struggled with the writing in these sections. Although the modern day in Syndicate kind of provides some plot progression, it's a very modest advance. I'm still hopeful that Ubisoft would either conclude the modern day story or make an important leap forward in the storyline. In fact, I think that's what they're going to do with Assassin's Creed Codename Red. I read somewhere that the modern day in the upcoming games will take place in a future setting, which is kind of crazy to think about. We'll just have to wait and see how that plays out, I guess. Anyway, the modern day in Assassin's Creed Syndicate is pretty much condensed into like 3 or 4 cutscenes, and the game's setup is essentially there was a piece of Eden in Victorian London and the modern day assassins seek its location, asking you as the player to go find it for them. While the modern day makes a slight effort compared to Unity's, it still relies heavily on those cutscenes. The only positive aspect to me is the presence of Sean and Rebecca, offering a glimpse of Sean stepping out of his comfort zone to infiltrate Abstergo with Rebecca. However, the disappointment lies in the fact that these events are presented through cutscenes rather than actual gameplay. Some people might appreciate this, considering the modern day gameplay a hindrance to Assassin's Creed, but I have a very different opinion. The standout moment for me out of this terrible modern day in Syndicate is the fight scene between the Templars and the Assassins, featuring Sean using the shock blade. The music and the visual of Sean actually taking down somebody instead of hiding away adds to the experience, but beyond that, the modern day segment just lacks substance. I mean, sure, there's also the inclusion of Juno, where she contacts the player, urging them to relive the memories of Lydia Fry during World War I, and while these missions are enjoyable, they don't exactly fit in the modern day category. So, overall, I find Assassin's Creed Syndicate to be a very in-the-middle game. It's not at all a great game, nor is it bad, it's just simply okay. The story is the biggest weakness in my opinion, and it definitely could have been a lot better, especially regarding Crawford Starrick, a villain that had potential but was wasted by Ubisoft. The setting, however, of Victorian London is stunning and is definitely one of my favourites out of the 13 mainland games. Its vibrancy and beauty exceeded my expectations. While I initially didn't think it would be different from Unity's Paris, the difference is quite astonishing. The most notable aesthetic distinctions lie in the ambient sounds, the echoes of steam engines, clattering of horse hooves on cobblestone streets, friction of carriage wheels against the ground, and even the sputtering of smoke from boats and ships creates such an immersive experience. I remember thinking I'd be concerned about the reduced crowd numbers in Assassin's Creed Syndicate when it was released, but that did not matter, because the world still felt very alive. There are still crowds, but they gather in places that make sense, like train stations and marketplaces, which to me showcases Ubisoft's consistent creation of settings and environments. Oh, and how can I almost forget that steampunk-esque soundtrack by Austin Wintory, which plays in the background when you're travelling around London. So yeah, it's important to emphasize that, in my opinion, Syndicate is not the best game in the series, but it's also far from the worst. Let me know what your thoughts are with Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Anyway, if you did enjoy this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button, it'll help me out quite a lot. And with all of that said, I'll see you in the next one.